Chapter 1. The Shifting Sands. The desert night was a vast, suffocating silence. No wind, no insect hum, no distant howl of jackal or cry of vulture. Only the deep stillness that clung to Nehekhara's sands like a shroud. Yet somewhere far beyond the jagged horizon, the air began to shift. First a tremor in the atmosphere, then a long, drawn-out groan that rolled over the dunes like the breath of some colossal beast. At the edge of the Valley of Silent Kings, a caravan of Taiyan traders huddled around a sputtering fire. Its light was feeble against the yawning dark, throwing long, twitching shadows across the cracked stones. Donkeys shifted restlessly, ears twitching at sounds their human masters could not yet hear. The leader of the caravan, a weathered man named Nehekhara, long enough to know when the desert silence was wrong. He stared into the pitch beyond the fire, and his hands, hard as the stone they had crossed, tightened on the hilt of his scimitar. It began with a whisper. Not the sound of wind through rock, but something more insidious. A hiss, dry and rattling, like scales dragged over bone. The horizon darkened, a bruise blooming across the stars. Chiro's youngest scout, a boy barely grown into his beard, pointed with wide eyes. A wall of sand was rising in the distance, not rolling as natural storms did, but building, as though something beneath the dunes was pushing the desert upward in a slow, terrible exhalation. Flickers of pale green light sparked within it like lightning glimpsed through dust. The air grew heavy, charged with the scent of ancient rot and scorched earth. The donkeys began to scream. "Pack! Pack now!" Chiro barked, his voice cracked with urgency. The traders scrambled, hands fumbling with ropes and satchels. One man, too slow, looked back just as the first tendrils of the storm reached them, thin whips of sand that curled unnaturally in the air, moving like living things. One wrapped around his ankle. He screamed, trying to tear free, but the sand tightened, grinding against skin until it peeled away in wet strips. His cries were drowned by the rising howl of the tempest. The wall of sand hit them like the fist of a god. The fire vanished in an instant, snuffed out and scattered into glowing embers that spun away into the maelstrom. The traders were ripped from their feet, tumbled end over end, mouths filling with grit until they could no longer breathe. Through the swirling chaos, Ciro saw shapes. Tall, lean figures walking in the storm, as if it were nothing more than a summer breeze. Their forms were half hidden in the dust, but he caught flashes of bronze breastplates, sun-cracked bone, and eyes that burned with corpse light. The figures turned its skull towards him. Its jaw opened, the sand streaming into its mouth as though feeding it. The sound it made was not human, a grinding, rasping groan like stone breaking under immense weight. Then it raised its weapon, a khopesh of blackened gold, and pointed toward the heart of the valley. The storm obeyed. In the hours that followed, the Valley of Silent Kings disappeared from the maps of the living. Where once lay sun-bleached ruins and broken statues, there was now only a churning ocean of dust, crowned with flashes of unnatural light. And among the scattered, dying remnants of Ciro's caravan, those who could still speak whispered of what they had seen in the heart of the tempest, of the dead, long buried, walking once more beneath the shadow of a crown of obsidian, and far below the sand, in a tomb untouched for 3,000 years, the Liche Priest opened his eyes. Chapter 2. The Tomb of Khepra-Zahn. The ruins of Akhm-Tekhet rose from the sands like a carcass picked clean by centuries. The air stank faintly of dust and sun-baked stone, with the metallic tang of old dried blood that only the desert seemed to preserve. Broken pillars leaned drunkenly in the shifting dunes, their carved hieroglyphs worn to shallow grooves by endless wind. Shattered statues of forgotten kings lay half-buried, faces worn away into eyeless masks, as if the desert itself had erased their names from history. Once in the air, the desert itself had erased their names from history. Captain Erich Volker rode at the head of the column, his black-lacquered breastplate reflecting the merciless sun in jagged flares. He was a broad-shouldered man in his middle years, his face tanned and cracked like old leather, his eyes the cold slate gray of a winter river. His men, 24 hardened killers, followed in loose formation, their mismatched armor clanking with each step. Their mounts snorted uneasily. Even the beasts could smell the wrongness here. Eric reined in at the edge of a shattered avenue, the remains of the city yawning before him. Once, this place had been a jewel of Nehekhara's empire, the ceremonial capital for the priests of the Burning Sun cult. Now, the streets were littered with debris, splintered chariot wheels, fragments of pottery, the occasional jutting limb of a corpse that had turned to leather under the desert heat. They had come for one thing, the Tomb of Khepra-Zahn. The name was a curse among the desert tribes. A Liche Priest of immeasurable power, Khepra-Zahn had ruled this city in the twilight of Nehekhara's glory, commanding armies of the dead with a voice like burning glass. He had been buried with relics of such value that even the risk of his curse was worth the attempt. "Fan out," Eric ordered. "Find the Sun Temple. The tomb will be beneath it." The mercenaries obeyed, spreading into the ruins. One, a hulking Norscan named Braka, kicked open the door of a half-buried shrine. A cloud of dust rolled out, carrying with it a swarm of desiccated beetles. They clung to his arms and face, their dry carapaces rasping as they dug in with needle-like legs. Braka's scream cut through the stillness as he clawed at his own skin, tearing bloody furrows into his cheeks before collapsing in the sand. The others stepped over his body without a word. Hours later they found it, the Sun Temple. The structure loomed above the ruins, its upper tiers partially collapsed, its golden capstone long since stolen by looters. Massive sandstone columns, carved with serpents and scarabs, lined the cracked steps. The double doors, each the height of 3 men, had been fused shut with some ancient resin that still glistened faintly in the heat. Eric studied the seals. His second-in-command, a wiry Estalian named Mardi, touched the resin with the tip of his dagger. "Deal with it." "It's warm," Mardez said, frowning. "Impossible in this heat. It's like it's alive." "Alive or not," Eric growled. "Break it." They set to work with hammers and chisels. The first strike made the resin shiver, as though recoiling. The second blow split it open. From the crack seeped a faint hiss, the smell of rotting myrrh and something far older, fouler. The men coughed as their eyes began to water. On the third blow the seal burst. A torrent of air rushed out, hot and foul, as though the temple had been holding its breath for millennia. It carried with it a sound, low, drawn out, and full of hunger. Inside was darkness. They lit torches and stepped in. The air was thick, almost solid, and with every step their boots crunched on something brittle. When Mardez bent to look, his torchlight caught the ground, thousands of human teeth, scattered like gravel. The main hall was vast, the ceiling supported by dozens of carved pillars depicting the sun's journey through life, death, and rebirth. At the far end, framed by 2 jackal-headed statues, was a black stairway leading down into the bowels of the temple. The steps were worn into shallow bowls by countless feet, though no living soul had walked them in 3,000 years. "Down," Eric said simply. The descent was long. The air grew colder, damper. The torches sputtered as if reluctant to burn here. At the base of the stairs, the corridor opened into a burial antechamber. Painted murals stretched across the walls. Battle scenes, rituals, processions of skeletal warriors. The colors were still vivid, as though painted yesterday. And there, in the center, lay the inner door. It was carved from obsidian, inlaid with gold hieroglyphs that writhed and shifted when looked at too long. Across its face was the image of a tall, gaunt figure draped in bandages, a golden crown atop his brow. His skeletal hands reached out, not to welcome, but to grasp, to claim. Beneath the carving, in the curling script of ancient Nehekhara, was an inscription. Mardez read it aloud. "Here sleeps Khepra-Zahn, Liche Priest of the burning sun. Disturb his rest and burn in the gaze of the eternal dawn." Eric smiled, but it was a hard, joyless thing. "Open it." No one noticed the faint vibration beneath their feet, like something deep in the earth, shifting in its sleep. Not yet. Chapter 3. The First Warning. The sun was falling into the west, bleeding molten gold across the dunes. The heat had not lessened, it clung to the stones like a fever, but shadows now stretched long and jagged through the ruins of Akhm-Tekhet. In that lengthening darkness, the mercenaries' torches began to throw uneasy, flickering light, their flames hissing as though in protest. Captain Erich Volker pushed forward through a half-buried street, his boots crunching over what he first thought was wind-scattered rubble. Then he looked closer. They were bones. Not the random debris of ancient corpses, but arranged, deliberately, meticulously, into patterns. Rib cages and femurs had been placed in perfect circles, with skulls set at equal intervals like markers on a clock. Each skull faced inward, their eyeless sockets turned toward the center, where a single obsidian shard stood upright, sunk into the sand as if driven there by great force. Mardez, his second, crouched beside one. "This isn't burial," he muttered. "It's something else." Before Eric could respond, the ground shifted beneath them. It was so subtle they might have missed it, just a faint settling, a sigh of sand and bone. But it came from beneath the circle. Braca, recovered enough from his earlier attack, stepped into one of the rings and jammed his spear into the sand. The spear came back up, slick. "Not water," Braca said, sniffing the dark smear on the shaft. "Blood." They moved on, leaving the circles behind. Yet as they walked, more appeared, dozens of them, scattered through the ruins like a map only the dead could read. Some were fresh, the bones still yellowed with sinew, the marrow not yet devoured by the desert. The street narrowed between two crumbling walls, their surfaces carved with weathered hieroglyphs. As the torchlight touched them, the carvings seemed to exhale. Thin streams of dust trickled from the glyphs' grooves, drifting down like the remnants of something ground to powder. Eric reached out to brush one and felt the stone tremble faintly beneath his gloved hand. Mardez drew back sharply. "They're bleeding." It was true. The grooves were not filled with dust from erosion, but producing it, as though the walls themselves were crumbling from within. The air grew thick with the taste of it, dry and metallic, and the men coughed as they hurried past. They emerged into a plaza dominated by a single statue. It was colossal, its jackal head staring down from a body clad in ornate, flaking armor. The eyes were inset with polished black stones, catching the last glimmer of moonrise. Eric's skin prickled. The wind shifted, carrying the faint rustle of sand across the plaza. A cloud passed over the rising moon. When the light returned, the statue's head was angled differently. Only slightly, but enough. The black gemstone eyes were fixed on him now. "No," Brackett muttered. "No, I saw it too. It moved." Eric drew his sword. The sound rang too loud in the stillness. The rest of the company stood frozen, eyes locked on the statue. Its carved snarl seemed deeper, sharper. The torch nearest it sputtered and went out. From the base of the statue, the sand shifted. A long, narrow crack appeared, widening until it was almost a mouth. A hiss came from within, dry, rasping, impossibly deep. Something scraped against stone. Eric stepped back slowly, every instinct screaming at him to turn and run. But he held his ground, the weight of command pressing down heavier than the fear. Then, without warning, the statue's eyes flared, not brightly, but with a dull, sickly green glow, like corpse light glimpsed through rotting flesh. The hiss grew into a low growl. The sand at its base boiled, writhing with movement, small skittering things spilling out between the cracks. Beetles. Hundreds of them. Their shells were the same color as the bones they devoured, their jaws snapping audibly as they poured toward the mercenaries in a living tide. The men broke formation, slashing wildly. The beetles did not scatter, they climbed, swarming up legs and armor, mandibles tearing through leather straps, biting into flesh. One man's scream was cut short as a cluster of them surged into his open mouth, burrowing down his throat. Howling, they brought his head down. Frantically, the dogs tried to fall back, Erich roared. They retreated through the plaza, the beetles chasing until they reached the far wall. Then, as abruptly as it had begun, the swarm stopped. The insects turned as one, flowing back to the statue like water draining from a basin. The crack at its base sealed, and the sickly glow in its eyes dimmed. The mercenaries stood gasping, nursing ragged wounds, blood dripping onto the sand. Eric looked back only once. The statue had returned to its original pose, but he could have sworn its mouth was open just a fraction wider. Chapter 4. The Awakening. Beneath the ruins of Akhm-Tekhet, far below the sun-baked stones and whispering sands, the Tomb of Khepra-Zahn lay in silence. The air was thick and stagnant, so heavy with the weight of ages that even sounds seemed hesitant to intrude. The only movement was the slow drift of dust motes, spiraling lazily through shafts of pale green light that leaked from ancient, still-burning braziers. The inner sanctum was a chamber of impossible scale, its ceiling lost in shadow, the walls carved with hieroglyphs so fine they seemed etched by the hands of gods. Gold inlays traced the rise and fall of dynasties long forgotten, their lines bending around grotesque reliefs of death and conquest. Armies of skeletal warriors grinding cities into rubble, priests offering screaming sacrifices to a blazing black. At the very center lay the sarcophagus. It was not stone, nor wood, but a strange amalgam of obsidian and gold, its surfaces polished to a mirror sheen. In that dark reflection, the flickering braziers made it seem as if the coffin pulsed with a slow, deliberate heartbeat. Great bronze chains bound it, each link as thick as a man's forearm, engraved with wards that glimmered faintly in the gloom. The wards began to break. First came the sound, a hairline crack, sharp and brittle as breaking bone. Then another. The glyphs along the chains dimmed, their glow dying like embers in ash. A deep, grinding groan rolled through the chamber, shaking the very stone. Inside the sarcophagus, a figure stirred. The lid shifted, grinding across its base with the weight of centuries. Dust billowed into the air, a choking cloud of ancient grave rot. A skeletal hand emerged, its bone the color of ivory, wrapped in desiccated strips of linen. Rings of gold and lapis lazuli adorned each finger, though the gems were dulled, their brilliance swallowed by the long dark. Khepra-Zahn rose. The Liche Priest's frame was tall, impossibly thin, his bones stretched by the unnatural elongation of embalmer's magic. His head was swathed in blackened wrappings, leaving only his eyes uncovered. Twin orbs of searing green light, burning with an intelligence that had endured across millennia. His jaw opened, a slow and deliberate motion, and the sound that issued forth was a whisper and a roar all at once. The language of the dead carried on a voice like grinding sand. The braziers flared. From the shadows along the walls, figures emerged, his retainers, embalmed servants whose wrappings had fused to their bones, their faces frozen in rictus masks of obedience. They fell prostrate before their master, the sound of their knees striking the stone, echoing like distant drums. Khepra-Zahn extended one long skeletal hand. His talons traced the air, drawing invisible sigils that shimmered briefly before burning into nothingness. He began to chant, each word a guttural invocation that resonated in the marrow, commanding the very elements to obey. Above, in the world of the living, the air shifted. The first wind came as a whisper through the ruins, carrying with it the taste of old tombs and long-dried blood. Then it grew, howling between shattered pillars, tearing at loose stones. Sand rose in thin spirals, reaching skyward like the fingers of buried corpses. The storm built with impossible speed. A wall of dust and grit surged up from the horizon, stretching across the valley in a solid mass. Lightning flickered within it, not the blue fight of the living storm, but a sickly green that lit the swirling clouds from within, revealing for an instant shapes that were not made of sand. Skulls, armored forms, vast skeletal hands clawing at the air. Khepra-Zahn's voice rose, his chants now a relentless command. The storm answered him, thickening, folding in upon itself until it became a colossal barrier, a living wall of sand infused with ancient magic. The wind screamed like the dead, carrying with it faint, distorted cries in the Nehekharan tongue. He spoke the final word, and the braziers guttered. The valley was sealed. The sandstorm became a ring, whirling in endless rotation, its surface streaked with runes of fire and bone. No mortal could pass through without being flayed to ribbons or drawn into the maelstrom, their flesh stripped and their soul claimed. Khepra-Zahn lowered his hands. The green light in his eyes flared once, then steadied to a cold, eternal burn. His gaze turned upward, toward the faint, muffled sounds of trespassers in his city. The living had come to his door, and he would greet them as only the dead could. Chapter 5. The storm closes. The first sign of trouble came as a low, almost animal moan carried on the wind. At first the mercenaries thought it was some distant beast, one of the desert's nocturnal predators stirring in the dark. But the sound deepened, grew, until the ground itself seemed to hymn beneath their boots. Sand began to hiss along the edges of the streets, curling around their ankles in thin spirals. The air thickened, as if the desert were drawing a deep, deliberate breath. Captain Erich Volker, standing at the head of the group, lifted a hand to halt the column. His eyes swept the horizon, but already the landmarks were blurring. Distant spires of broken masonry wavered like mirages, their edges dissolving into a dull ochre haze. Then the wind hit. It slammed into them with the force of a charging horse, tearing cloaks and headscarves loose, ripping weapons from unwary hands. The sand was not the loose shifting dust of the open dunes. It was heavy, biting, filled with unseen grit that struck exposed skin like 1,000 tiny knives. Men cried out, staggering back, blood smearing their cheeks where the wind had already flayed them raw. But when they turned, the way was gone. The avenue they had entered by was nothing but a solid wall of swirling brown. Shapes moved within it, vague, man-sized silhouettes that lurched and shifted, appearing for only an instant before vanishing again. The wind carried with it faint voices, half heard through the shriek of the storm, whispering in a language none of them understood, but which chilled them to the marrow. Eric forced his way forward, head down, feeling the grit grinding against his teeth with every breath. He tried to navigate by memory, by the placement of collapsed arches and toppled statues, but one by one, each landmark was swallowed by the sand. The familiar became alien. The ruins twisted in upon themselves, streets bending where they should have been straight, walls appearing where moments before there had been open space. It was as if the city itself was moving. A man at the rear of the group, a Reiklander named Stern, broke formation in a panic and bolted toward a gap in the storm. He vanished almost instantly. For a heartbeat, they could see him inside the maelstrom, arms up to shield his face, legs pumping furiously. Then something dark and skeletal rose from the sand around him, too fast to be real. His scream was high, sharp, and short. When the wind shifted, only scraps of armor tumbled back to their feet, polished clean of all flesh. "Stay together," Eric roared. He could barely hear his own voice. The storm was not simply wind and dust. It pressed against them, resisted their movements, funneled them down paths they did not choose. Each turn seemed to lead deeper into the ruins. The air burned their lungs, every breath tasting of copper and rot. Their eyes watered until vision was reduced to vague outlines, and even the torchlight was swallowed whole, its glow reduced to a faint orange smear. They came to a courtyard, half collapsed and open to the sky. Here the storm roared above them like a living ceiling, a spinning vortex of grit that blotted out the moon entirely. The walls were cracked and leaning, their carvings half buried in sand. A broken fountain stood at the center, the stone figures long since eroded into grotesque shapes. "We hold here," Erish said, voice harsh from the grit in his throat. The men staggered to the lee of a half-standing wall, pressing themselves into the shallow shelter. The sand still found them, creeping in through every gap, stinging their faces and hands. A gust tore through the courtyard and brought with it something heavy, a skull stripped clean, bouncing once before coming to rest against Eric's boot. The captain stared at it. It was human, but the eye sockets had been lined with gold leaf, and faint traces of blackened hieroglyphs were etched into the bone. As he watched, the markings began to shift, reforming into new patterns. A faint hiss rose from the skull's mouth, and a fine trickle of sand poured out onto the stones. Several men muttered prayers to Sigmar, Mor, or any god that might still listen in this cursed place. The wind rose again, and for a moment the storm outside the courtyard parted, just enough to reveal a shape standing atop a crumbled wall. It was tall, robed in strips of linen that fluttered like banners in the wind. Its face was a mask of bone and gold, its eyes two sickly green coals burning in the dark. One withered arm lifted, and the storm answered, slamming back into place with renewed fury. The figure was gone when the wind shifted again, but its presence lingered. Erich tightened his grip on his sword. "We move at first light," he said, though all of them knew the light would never truly return here. Somewhere above, the storm laughed. Chapter 6. The Jackal Guard. The storm had not relented. It pulsed and shifted around them, sealing them inside the labyrinth of ruins like insects trapped under glass. Eric's men moved in silence now, their eyes raw from sand, their armor dulled and pitted by the ceaseless grit. Even their weapons looked weary, blades scoured and edges dulled, as if the desert itself was gnawing on them. They had just passed under the arch of a half-collapsed gateway when the ground beneath their boots trembled. It was not the subtle hum of shifting sand they had grown used to. This was heavier, deeper, like the beat of an enormous heart far underground. Mardez froze mid-step, his torchlight flickering wildly in the sudden gust of wind that seemed to come from nowhere. "You feel that?" he whispered. The reply came not in words but in sound, a grinding of stone on stone, echoing from somewhere ahead, then another, closer, like the shifting of enormous feet. The men formed up instinctively, shields raised, weapons out. The first silhouette emerged from the sand haze like a nightmare given form. It was tall, twice the height of any man, and broad of shoulder, its body a fusion of carved stone, polished bronze, and the bones of some titanic beast. Its head was that of a jackal, elongated and cruel, the muzzle filled with jagged obsidian fangs. Its eyes burned with an inner gold that glared through the storm. One clawed hand gripped a khopesh the size of a scythe, the blade still sharp despite the century. It was an ushabti, one of the sacred constructs of Nehekhara, a guardian wrought from the bones of great beasts and animated with the souls of warriors who had served their god-kings in life. It was not alone. Two more emerged behind it, their towering forms moving with the slow, deliberate grace of predators. Their heavy footfalls cracked stone as they advanced, the ground shaking with each step. Eric barked an order, and the mercenaries unleashed a volley of crossbow bolts. The missiles struck the first ushabti in the chest and shoulders, but the thing did not even slow. The bolts shattered against its armor, splintering like dry twigs. Then it charged. The impact was devastating. Its khopesh swept through the front rank of mercenaries, shearing through mail and flesh alike. One man's head was taken clean off, his body collapsing in a geyser of blood that spattered the faces of those behind him. Another was split from shoulder to hip, his scream choked off as his insides hit the sand in a steaming heap. The second ushabti waded into the left flank, its claws closing around a soldier's torso. The man thrashed, beating at its wrist with his sword, but the construct simply squeezed. Ribs popped audibly, and blood gushed from the man's mouth before the ushabti hurled the limp body into the storm. The sand swallowed him whole. The third struck from the right, backhanding a mercenary into a wall so hard his spine snapped, with a sound like breaking kindling. His body slid down, leaving a crimson smear on the stone, before crumpling lifeless at the base. "Form tight, shields," Erach roared, shoving men into position. But the ushabti were relentless. Their khopesh blades smashed through shields as though they were parchment, severing arms still clutching the straps. The constructs moved with inhuman precision, striking not to wound, but to kill or disable in a single blow. Mardez managed to drive his sword between the plates of one's leg, the steel biting into the ancient sinew beneath. The ushabti turned, its jackal face emotionless, and seized him by the head. With one smooth motion, it lifted him off the ground and slammed him down hard enough to shatter his skull against the stones. Blood sprayed in an arc, dark and heavy in the storm's dim light. The survivors fell back, stumbling over the dead and dying. The ushabti did not pursue far. Instead, they began to gather the fallen. With clawed hands, they dragged the corpses toward a large depression in the sand at the far side of the street. A pit ringed with jagged stones, its bottom lost to shadow. One by one, the dead were cast into it. Eric caught sight of the first body tumbling down, and for a moment he thought he saw movement within, shapes shifting in the darkness, the faint glimmer of countless insectile eyes. A dry, rustling sound rose from below, accompanied by a smell of rot and centuries-old incense. The last thing he saw before the storm swallowed the ushabti again was one of the constructs lowering its head toward the pit, as if in reverence. An offering, he realized grimly. The gods of this place still fed. Chapter 7. The necropolis revealed. The storm broke without warning. It was not a gentle easing, no slow fade of wind into stillness. It was as if an unseen hand simply commanded the sands to fall. One moment the world was nothing but grinding grit and the scream of the gale. The next there was an oppressive, ringing silence. The air hung heavy, the sky above a bruised yellow-gray, choked with high clouds that writhed unnaturally. When the dust settled, the survivors saw it. The storm had flayed the desert bare, peeling away centuries of wind-packed sand to expose the bones of a city that should have remained buried forever. Towering above them, black and gold pyramid spires clawed at the sky like the jagged teeth of some colossal predator. Between them stretched vast avenues lined with statues, Pharaohs, gods, and monsters, each carved in exquisite detail, each staring down with an air of cold judgment. The scale of the necropolis was staggering. It went on for miles, a labyrinth of temples, colonnades, and monumental tombs. Stone causeways, wide enough for 6 chariots abreast, led to gateways adorned with reliefs of war and sacrifice, human figures bowing beneath the feet of towering skeletal kings. Pools of stagnant water glimmered faintly, their surfaces black and still, untouched by wind. But what struck the mercenaries most was the sound. A low hum filled the air, so deep it was almost felt rather than heard. It resonated in their bones, in their teeth, in the backs of their skulls. It was not the sound of life. It was the vibration of something vast and dead, a presence that had lain dormant for centuries, but was now watching. Eric Volka's breath steamed in the unnatural chill that clung to the air. The sun above was still blazing, but its heat no longer touched them. "Sigmar's blood," muttered one of the men. "It's a city of the dead." They moved forward cautiously, boots crunching on a layer of bone dust that coated the streets like frost. Every step seemed louder than it should have been, echoing off the vast stone faces that loomed from all sides. Here and there the sand had not receded entirely, leaving half-buried statues that seemed to be clawing their way up from the dunes. They passed a row of smaller pyramids, their tops carved into the heads of jackals, hawks, and scarab beetles. The entrances yawned open, and from within came a faint, stale breeze carrying the smell of dried blood and embalming resins. Then they reached the plaza. It was enormous, dominated by a central obelisk taller than any cathedral spire, its surface etched from base to tip with hieroglyphs that seemed to writhe if looked at too long. Around the base lay the broken remains of lesser monuments, stone coffins split open, their occupants reduced to dust and fragments. The sand here had a strange reddish tint, as though it had been stained long ago and the color had never truly faded. Mardez knelt to examine a crack in the paving stones. "It's warm," he said, frowning. "Not from the sun, from below." Before Eric could answer, a sound rolled across the necropolis. It was not the howl of the storm or the whisper of the wind. It was a deep, resonant drumbeat. One beat, then another, then a third, each louder, closer, until the paving stones vibrated beneath their boots. The obelisk flared, not brightly, but with a dull green glow that pulsed in time with the beats. The hum in the air rose, and the temperature seemed to drop another degree. From the shadows at the far end of the plaza, shapes began to emerge. They were tall, man-high at least, and swathed in grave wrappings that clung like second skin. Golden pectorals gleamed across rib cages and bronze blades hung at their sides. Their faces were nothing but withered skulls, yet their eyes burned with pinpoints of cold emerald fire. They moved in perfect unison, their bare feet silent on the stone, their gaze fixed on the living intruders. The men tightened their grips on their weapons. Even Braca, who had scoffed at curses and omens, was pale now. One of the undead warriors stopped a few paces ahead and raised a hand. At its gesture, the ground beneath the mercenaries shifted. Sand hissed as it drained away between the paving stones, revealing a mass grave beneath, a pit packed with the skeletons of hundreds, their jaws open in eternal screams. The stench that rose from it was so strong it made eyes water and stomachs churn. Eric realized then that the storm had not revealed this place by accident. It had been opened, and they were already inside the trap. Chapter 8. The Curse of the Sun. Dusk. The street narrowed into a long colonnade, its towering pillars leaning like drunken giants, their tops lost in shadow. Beyond it the air shimmered, not with heat, but with a strange wavering distortion, as though the world itself bent around something ahead. They emerged into a courtyard that had been half swallowed by the sands. On three sides, walls of black basalt rose sheer and unbroken, carved with images of chariots, armies, and the burning orb of the sun. At the far end, half buried and tilted at a drunken angle, stood an altar unlike any they had yet seen. It was a disk of solid gold, easily 10 paces across, its edges etched with curling glyphs that gleamed even in the dim light. The central face was engraved with the blazing sun, its rays reaching outward in jagged lines like clutching fingers. Time had not dulled it. The surface shone with a brightness that hurt the eyes, as though the gold itself drank in the light around it. A shallow mound of sand lay at its base, piled high enough to partially obscure the lower carvings. Bones jutted from the mound here and there, their ends blackened and warped, as if they had been melted. Ital's beard. Marness muttered, stepping forward, his torchlight dancing across the disk's polished face. This is worth more than everything we've found so far put together. Brocca's eyes gleamed with greed. Worth more than Wistland, more than Tilea, more than Sigmar's throne. Eric said nothing, only gestured for them to approach with caution. The hum in the air was stronger here, almost deafening now, making the very stones underfoot vibrate. One of the younger sellswords, a lad named Dren, broke ranks and stepped toward the altar. "Captain, if we can just—" "Dren, don't touch," Eric began, but the warning came too late. The boy reached out with one gloved hand, brushing away some of the sand from the disk's base. The moment his fingers touched the gold, the glyphs flared. The sun at the center seemed to expand, its carved rays lengthening, twisting into jagged talons. The hum became a shriek that stabbed into their skulls, and the air ignited. It was not fire as they knew it. It was light. A blinding, searing radiance that erupted from the disk and enveloped Dren entirely. He screamed, a high, animal sound, clutching at his face as his flesh blackened in the space of a heartbeat. The glow poured into his mouth and eyes, burning him from within. His skin bubbled and split. Fat liquefied and dripped in thick, smoking rivulets down his arms. His armor glowed cherry red, the metal hissing as it seared through what remained of him. In moments, he was no more than a writhing silhouette inside a cocoon of radiant fire, bones glowing through melting flesh before crumbling into black ash. When the light faded, all that remained was his armor, twisted and warped by the heat, slumped into the sand like the shed skin of something long dead. The smell that hung in the air was thick and greasy, a nauseating mix of charred meat and burnt metal. The disk was still glowing faintly, its glyphs pulsing with a slow heartbeat, as if it had fed well and was now content. No one spoke. Finally Erish broke the silence. "No one touches it. No one goes near it. We move around." They skirted the edge of the courtyard, every man keeping his eyes fixed on the sand. Still, Eric could feel it, like the gaze of a predator hidden in the brush. The altar watched them as they passed, its golden face gleaming hungrily in the half-light. And deep in the stone beneath their feet, something old and patient shifted, sensing that the living had trespassed further still. Chapter 9. The Dead Speak. They found it in the shadow of a crumbling causeway. The head was mounted on a rusted iron spike, the shaft driven deep into the paving stones as though nailed there by some ancient executioner. What remained of the flesh was parchment thin, drawn tight over a skull as yellowed as old ivory. The lips were split and pulled back into a permanent rictus, revealing teeth capped in gold. A thin veil of blackened linen still clung to its scalp, and across its brow sat a narrow circlet of beaten bronze set with dull, cloudy gems. But what truly made the thing arresting was the cage. It was no simple prison of bars and hinges. The frame was wrought from gold and lapis, each curve etched with hieroglyphs so fine that the eye could barely follow them. The metal arched and twisted into strange, unnatural angles, and in its design there was no opening, no door, no latch, only a lattice of precious metal wrapped perfectly around the skull, as if it had grown there. The bars did not touch the flesh but hovered just above it, shimmering faintly with a light that was not of this world. The men slowed as they approached, weapons half raised, uncertain if they looked upon some ancient relic or another of the city's countless traps. The air here was thick with the stale scent of old myrrh, and something far less pleasant, like meat left too long in the sun. "Captain," Braca muttered, "what in Moro's name is—" The head's eyes opened. Twin points of cold green light flared in the sockets, dim at first, then brightening to a sickly, steady glow. The jaw sagged open, and when the voice came, it was not the rasp of a dead throat. It was smooth, deep, and disturbingly warm, as if the thing were addressing them from across a great distance. "Children of the sunless lands, you walk unbidden in the realm of kings." Several men swore under their breath, backing away. Mardez stepped forward cautiously, his face tight with suspicion. "What are you?" The head turned to him, the cage's jewels glinting in the half-light. "I am the herald of Khepra-Zahn, the burning sun, master of the eternal dawn. I am the voice that once called armies to war, the tongue that spoke the will of the gods. And I have been left here to—" "Greet you?" Eric's voice was hard. "Greet us, or warn us?" The head's smile widened, not with lips, but with a faint shifting of the skin, a horrible suggestion of mirth. "Both. You have wandered, where the storm should have swallowed you. Your deaths are certain, unless you would serve a higher purpose." The men exchanged wary glances. Greed and fear wrestled in their eyes. "And that purpose?" Eric asked. "Free me from this prison." The glow in its eyes intensified. "The Liche Priest has bound me here for 1,000 years, my counsel silenced, my wisdom wasted. Break the cage, and I shall lead you from this place. I know the hidden ways, the paths beneath the sand where the storm cannot touch you." Mardez leaned in, studying the intricate gold lattice. "Looks solid. Could be worth something." The head's gaze fixed on him. "It is worth your lives." Braca stepped forward, hefting his axe. "If you're lying—" "I do not lie. I advise. And I tell you now, there are worse things than my master's guardians in these streets." Something in its tone, the silky smoothness undercut by an edge of hunger, made Eric's skin crawl. But desperation was a powerful motivator, and the men set to work, hacking at the bars with axe and blade. The metal rang like a bell at every blow, sending thin, keening notes into the air that made their teeth ache. When at last the final bar split, a faint pulse of green light washed over the street. The air grew colder. The head tilted back slightly, inhaling a breath it could not possibly take. "Free, the path lies this way." It turned on the spike, not twisting the wood, but pivoting itself with an impossible, smooth motion. The light in its eyes beckoned, and the men followed. The route it chose was not toward the outer walls, but deeper into the necropolis. The streets grew narrower, the statues more grotesque. Figures with stretched limbs and mouths open too wide, their stone eyes following the living as they passed. The air took on a strange vibration, the same low hum that had haunted the city, but now threaded with whispers too soft to catch. Braca shifted uneasily. "This doesn't feel like we're heading out." "It is the only way," the head replied, almost kindly. "The true gate lies within the earth. Only there can you escape the eyes of the storm." But Eric noticed something then. The herald's voice, always calm, had grown heavier, slower, each word more deliberate, as though savoring the sound. And though its cage was broken, the faint light that shimmered between its bars was stronger now, pulsing in time with their footsteps. It was not leading them to freedom. It was leading them home. Chapter 10. The Bone Dunes. The first sight of it froze the mercenaries where they stood. Before them stretched a dune, but it was not made of sand. It was a mound of bleached bone, rising in a long, uneven slope beneath the sickly glow of the storm-filtered sky. Skulls, femurs, ribcages, shattered spines, all jumbled together, packed so tightly they formed a solid mass. In places, the wind had polished them to a sick ivory gleam. In others, scraps of sinew and tattered cloth still clung, swaying faintly in the dry breeze. The herald's head, cradled under Mardeth's arm like some grotesque idol, turned its burning gaze upon the dune. "You must cross," it said, its voice low and almost reverent. "This is the ossuary of kings. Beneath it lie the honored dead of 1,000 wars. Tread with respect, or be claimed." No one wanted to go first. Finally, Eric gritted his teeth and stepped forward. His boot crunched into a ribcage, snapping the brittle bones like twigs. The sound echoed far louder than it should have. The others followed, the whole company moving in single file across the slope, weapons drawn, eyes scanning the haze. Every step sank them ankle-deep into the ossuary. It wasn't the way sand gave way, it was yielding, as if the bones themselves shifted under their weight. More than once a hand, not flesh but skeletal, rose from the mass to grip a boot or leg. The fingers were thin but impossibly strong, the bones grinding like stone in their joints. Men cursed and kicked free, leaving boot soles streaked with pale dust that clung like chalk. Halfway across, they began to hear it. It started as a faint hiss, like the sifting of sand through a sieve. Then it grew, a chorus of whispers, countless voices speaking in a tongue none of them knew but which clawed at the inside of the skull. The words slid through their ears and into their blood, cold and oily, carrying with them a sense of infinite age and infinite hunger. Braca was the first to falter. He froze mid-step, head tilting as if listening to something far off. "They're calling me," he murmured, his voice distant. "They know my name. More, they know my name." "Keep moving," Eric barked, but Braca ignored him, stepping away from the path. The bone dunes seemed to welcome him, hands rising in waves to grip his legs, pull him deeper. By the time the others reached him, he was waist-deep, still muttering to the voices only he could hear. When Mardeth grabbed for him, Braca turned, and the look in his eyes was not human. He lunged, teeth bared, biting deep into Mardeth's forearm. Blood sprayed, and Mardeth screamed, driving his dagger into Braca's neck. It didn't slow him. He laughed, and sank entirely into the bones, dragged down by a dozen grasping hands, until the last of him was gone. The whispers grew louder. The bones around them began to stir in earnest now, shifting in great waves like the swell of a white ocean. From beneath the surface, shapes emerged, not skeletons, but figures of tattered black, their forms rippling like smoke. Their faces were featureless masks of sand and shadow, but their hands, long, clawed, and skeletal, reached with single-minded purpose for the living. Sand waiths. The first struck from below, its claws raking open the belly of a rakelander before he could even cry out. The man's guts spilled steaming onto the bones, only to vanish as the wraith's form flowed over him, absorbing flesh, armor, and bone alike into its formless body. Another rose behind them, wrapping its arms around a Thailand sellsword. The man thrashed, screaming, as the wraith's touch began to leach the color from him, skin graying, lips blackening, eyes clouding to white. In seconds, he was nothing but another desiccated corpse in the ossuary, his empty sockets staring at the sky. "Run!" Eric roared. They sprinted, boots slipping on the shifting mound. The wraiths pursued, gliding across the surface without disturbing it, their whispers now a deafening cacophony. One darted ahead, rising in front of Eric like a wall of shadow. He slashed through it with his sword, the blade passing as if through water, scattering grains of black sand that swirled in the wind, only for the wraith to reform, whole again, its faceless gaze unbroken. The herald's head laughed. They do not tire. They do not forgive. They will follow you until you feed them. They reached the far slope and tumbled down into solid sand, panting and bleeding. The wraiths did not cross. They lingered at the crest, their forms shifting restlessly, watching. The whispers faded, but the bone dune behind them seemed to pulse faintly, as if breathing. As they gathered themselves, Eric looked back one last time. Bracca's face stared out from the ossuary now, half buried among the skulls, mouth open in a silent scream, eyes wide and unblinking. Eric, and the dune was still moving. Chapter 11. The Chamber of the Four Kings. The stairway descended in a long, narrow spiral, the stone steps worn into shallow curves by feet that had walked them centuries before the old world was born. The air was cold and heavy, thick with the scent of dust, old oils, and the faint metallic tang of dried blood. Torches sputtered in the stillness, their flames struggling against a presence that seemed to press in from every side. When the last step was taken, the passage opened into a vast subterranean hall. The ceiling was lost in shadow, supported by pillars carved in the likeness of bound slaves, their faces frozen in agony. The floor was a mosaic of gold and obsidian tiles, depicting a sun rising over a field of corpses. At the far end stood 4 colossal statues, each towering more than 20 feet high. They were kings, at least they had been once. The first was draped in armor fashioned from gilded plates and chains, a high crown upon his jackal-headed helm. The second bore the visage of a hawk, its sharp beak curving down over a breastplate inlaid with lapis and turquoise. The third's face was that of a man, regal but cold, a golden mask hiding the desiccated features beneath. The last was skeletal, crowned with jagged shards of obsidian, its hands clasping a double-headed spear that seemed forged from bone itself. Their stances were still, but their eyes, set with gemstones of green and amber, seemed to follow the intruders. "They're just statues," one of the men muttered, but the quaver in his voice betrayed his doubt. The herald's head, cradled under Modred's arm, turned its gaze toward the giants. "The 4 kings of Khepra-Zahn, his generals in life, his sentinels in death. Do not disturb them." But the path forward ran between them. As they approached, Eric noticed the floor's mosaic changed. The corpses gave way to scenes of war, armies of skeletal soldiers marching in perfect formation, banners of gold fluttering in winds no living man could feel. The images were so vivid that, for a moment, it was as though the floor shifted beneath their feet, the dead reaching upward to grasp their ankles. Halfway through the hall, Mardez stumbled over a raised tile. It cracked under his boot, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the vast space. The herald hissed. "Fools, the seal!" The floor shuddered. A deep groan rumbled through the stone, so low it vibrated in the bones of their chests. The statues' jeweled eyes flared, emerald and amber lights spilling across their faces. The gilded plates of their armor ground against one another as the first king's head tilted down, regarding them with a predator's patience. Then they moved. The jackal-headed king stepped forward, each stride making the floor quake. Dust fell from the ceiling in thin streams as it drew its khopesh from the scabbard across its back. The sound was like steel being sharpened against a tombstone. The hawk-headed king spread its arms, and great slabs of stone unfolded from its sides like wings, the edges lined with jagged bone spurs. The man-faced king reached to its hip and drew a blade carved entirely from ivory, its edge glistening as though wet. The skeletal king simply gripped its double-headed spear tighter, the air around it shimmering with heatless fire. "Form ranks," Erich bellowed, but the words were almost lost in the thunder of the giant's advance. The first blow came from the jackal-headed king, its khopesh sweeping low. The blade caught two men at the waist, cleaving them clean in half. Their upper bodies slid to the ground a heartbeat before their legs collapsed, intestines spilling in glistening coils under the gold and obsidian tiles. The hawk-headed king leapt, impossibly fast for its size, wings snapping forward, the bone spurs along their edges scythed through armor and flesh alike. One mercenary's head was torn from his shoulders in a spray of arterial mist, his helmet spinning away into the shadows. Another's arm was severed at the elbow, his scream high and wet before a second strike split his chest open. The man-faced king advanced with eerie calm, its ivory blade flickering in tight, precise arcs. It stabbed a Rakelander through the gut, lifting him effortlessly before slamming him down so hard that the tiles cracked beneath the impact. Blood spread in a dark halo under his twitching body. The skeletal king struck last, sweeping its spear in a wide arc that smashed three men from their feet. One landed in a heap, limbs bent at unnatural angles. Another's skull burst like rotten fruit under the weight of the blow. The third was impaled on the spear's jagged end, writhing until the skeletal king drove him into the floor and pinned him there like an insect on a display. "Fall back, to the columns," Erich roared. They retreated between the carved slave pillars, using the narrow space to limit the giant's reach. But even here they were not safe. One of the kings reached between two pillars, its fingers closing around a man's head and crushing it to pulp before dropping the body like refuse. The herald's voice cut through the chaos. "The gems! Take their eyes, only then will they sleep again." Erich locked eyes with Mardez. They understood. While the others fought to distract the kings, the two of them darted forward. Erich leapt onto the jackal-headed king's foot, climbing the ridged armor as it swung at the others. He drove his sword into the socket of its left eye, prying the gemstone loose in a shower of green light. The colossus bellowed, a sound like a landslide, and staggered back, clutching its ruined face. Mardez repeated the feat with the hawk-headed king, wrenching free its amber jewel. The statue froze mid-motion, the light in its remaining eye dimming before it slumped backward, crashing into the wall with enough force to shake the entire hall. One by one they blinded the guardians, and one by one the colossal kings froze, their bodies stiffening, the light in their eyes guttering out like dying candles. When the last gem fell, the silence returned. The four kings stood once more in perfect stillness, their weapons lowered, their empty sockets staring blindly into the dark. The mercenaries stood among the dead and the wreckage, panting, their armor slick with blood, not all of it their own. The floor was slick, the golden tiles drowned in crimson. The only sound was the drip of blood from blade edges and broken armor. The herald's head smiled faintly. "The way is open." But Erich could not help glancing back at the statues as they moved on, half expecting one of them to take another step. For though their eyes were dark, he knew stone could remember, and stone could wait. Chapter 12. The Liche's Bargain. The great stone doors groaned as they swung inward, their movements slow and deliberate, as if the tomb itself was reluctant to open. A breath of stale, dry air rolled out from the darkness beyond, carrying with it the scent of age-old incense, scorched dust, and something older still, the sour tang of death that had been kept too long. Beyond lay a chamber vast enough to swallow a cathedral. Its walls were lined with towering columns carved in the likeness of skeletal priests, their hands raised in eternal supplication. The floor was a mirror of polished black stone, so perfect it seemed they walked across the surface of still water. Above, the vaulted ceiling was lost to shadow, but from its unseen heights hung chains bearing hundreds of bronze bowls, each filled with a ghostly green flame that gave the room its unearthly light. At the far end, upon a dais of obsidian and gold, stood a throne, and upon that throne sat Khepra-Zahn. He was tall even in repose, his frame gaunt and elongated, the angles of his bones sharp beneath the tattered strips of sun-bleached linen that clung to him. What little flesh remained was dark and withered, stretched thin over the jut of ribs and cheekbones. His hands, long, skeletal things with talons of blackened gold, rested lightly on the arms of his throne, their stillness somehow more unnerving than any movement. On his skull sat a crown wrought of obsidian and gold, its jagged points rising like the broken spires of some hellish city. It was not a thing made for beauty, but for dominion. At its center burned a single great emerald, so deep a green it seemed to contain swirling shadows within. His eyes opened. Twin points of cold green fire burned in the sockets, brightening until they filled the chamber with their glow. When he spoke, his voice was not loud, but it was everywhere, filling the air, the stone beneath their boots, even the space inside their skulls. Richard Velker. The captain froze. The sound of his name in that voice was like hearing it spoken from the grave. You have trespassed far into my realm. You have crossed the bone dunes, disturbed the four kings, and yet you stand before me still. Few among the living could claim such a feat. The mercenaries shifted uneasily, weapons in trembling hands. The herald's head, tucked beneath Mardita's arm, was silent now, its role done, its betrayal complete. Khepra-Zahn rose. The movement was slow, but it carried with it the weight of centuries. The linen strips fluttered faintly, though there was no wind. With each step down the dais, the green flames in the bronze bowls flared higher, throwing long, twisting shadows across the black floor. "I offer you this, Captain," the leech said, stopping at the base of the dais. "Life without end. No sickness, no age, no fear of the sword or the grave. You and your warriors will serve at my side, commanders in my legions, conquerors of the lands that dare defy me. All the gold and glory your mortal hearts crave will be yours, forever." Eric's grip tightened on his sword. "And the price?" The leech's skull tilted, the green fire in his eyes flaring. "Only your obedience. Your will becomes mine, your blood mine. You will slay at my command, march at my word, and kill without hesitation. The choice is simple, Captain. Eternity in my service, or death beneath the sands." He took another step forward, and the black floor beneath him rippled. The ripples swelled into waves, and from them hands began to rise, skeletal, desiccated, clawing at the air. They belonged to warriors long dead, their skulls still adorned with rusted helms, their armor fused to their bones. They dragged themselves upward until they stood in a loose ring around the living, weapons of bronze and bone clutched in their hands. The green light from Khepra-Zahn's eyes bathed the mercenaries, and one of them, a young Telian, dropped his sword and fell to his knees, mouth slack, eyes glazed. He crawled toward the leash like a moth toward flame. Without breaking eye contact with Eric, Khepra-Zahn extended one clawed hand and cupped it under the man's chin. A single whispered word passed the lich's lipless mouth. The Tyleran convulsed, his back arching, his skin shriveling in moments as every drop of moisture was sucked from him. His eyes sank into their sockets, his lips split, and then he was a husk, still on his knees, swaying slightly before crumbling into dust. The skeletal warriors tightened their circle, the sound of bone on bone echoing in the vast chamber. The green flames flared again, and Eric could feel the heatless fire against his skin. a pressure that seemed to push at his very thoughts, urging him to kneel. Mardez glanced at him, face pale, lips pressed into a thin line. The men looked to their captain, their fates hanging in the silence that followed. Eric's sword rose a fraction. Khepra-Zahn's eyes burned brighter still. "Choose, mortal." And the black floor beneath them shifted again, as if the sands themselves waited hungrily for his answer. Chapter 13. The Storm's Heart. Eric's answer came without hesitation. "No." The word cracked through the chamber like a musket shot. The mercenaries tensed, weapons coming up, every man ready to die where he stood rather than kneel. Khepra-Zahn's eyes narrowed, the green fire flaring into a violent blaze. "Then you will be unmade." The floor split. Black stone cracked open into jagged fissures, and from them poured hands, bony, rotting, some still shrouded in ragged armor, grabbing at boots, ankles, calves. A Reichlander screamed as skeletal fingers found his leg, yanking him down with such force that his knee popped in a spray of blood before his whole body vanished beneath the stone, leaving only the sound of frantic scraping below. Eric pointed his blade toward the far archway at the back of the throne room. "Move! That's where the storm is coming from." They surged forward. The leech's bellow rolled across the hall, not in words but in a roar of rage and command, and his skeletal guards surged after them. Mardez slashed one down, only for the thing to keep crawling after him, jaws snapping. Bracca's replacement, an Estalian named Corvo, had his throat bitten out before he could even swing, arterial spray misting the black stone. They burst through the archway and into a long corridor lined with walls of translucent crystal. Shapes moved within, half-formed things with too many limbs, their features stretching and melting in slow, nightmarish motion. The whisper of the storm grew louder, becoming a howl, and the corridor opened into the central chamber. It was vast, circular, and filled with a swirling maelstrom of sand suspended in mid-air. It didn't obey gravity or wind. It moved as though it were alive, coiling and folding into itself like a serpent in water. Lightning of sickly green and pale gold crackled within, illuminating something at its core. It was a heart. Not a symbol, not a carving. An actual heart, the size of a man's torso, petrified to a stone-like hardness, yet still beating. Every thud sent a shockwave through the air, stirring the sand into sharper, more violent eddies. The arteries and veins that once fed it had been replaced by thick strands of gold and obsidian, which anchored it to a black altar beneath. As the mercenaries entered, the air pressed down on them, thick and hot despite the storm's endless motion. Sand began to snake out toward them, thin tendrils at first, then thicker cords, each tipped with claws of crystallized grit that slashed at their armor and skin. One man's cheek was stripped to the bone in a single rake, his scream lost in the chamber's deafening wind. Eric pointed his sword at the altar. "Break it! Everything you've got!" They moved in, hacking at the tendrils as they came. Each cut scattered sand into the air, only for it to rejoin the storm seconds later. Mardez darted forward, ducking under a sweeping claw, and smashed his torch against the altar's base. Fire bloomed for a heartbeat, but the storm snuffed it out instantly. The smoke pulled away into the maelstrom. "Palika," Mardez called, a small maelstrom. The heart beat faster. The sound was everywhere, in their ears, their bones, their teeth. The sand coiled into the shape of a massive arm, ending in a taloned hand, and slammed down. It caught a mercenary mid-charge, crushing him into the black stone so hard that his spine snapped in two places. His body dangled for a moment in the sand's grip, before the grains tore inward, flaying flesh and muscle away in wet strips, until nothing remained but a bleached skeleton, still twitching. Eric grabbed a fallen spear, its bronze head jagged and dull, and hurled it into the heart. The weapon struck with a wet, meaty thunk, sinking half its length into the petrified flesh. A sound like a groan escaped the storm, and for a moment the wind faltered. Again he shouted. The others followed, hurling blades, smashing shields, hacking at the golden veins that anchored the heart. One finally snapped with a metallic scream, spraying shards of obsidian across the chamber. Another followed, then another. The storm shrieked, the sand thrashing in great arcs that sliced open armor and flesh alike. A mercenary was lifted bodily into the air, spinning helplessly before being flung head-first into the wall, with a sound like a melon bursting. Eric leapt onto the altar itself, driving his sword down with both hands into the heart. The green lightning flared blindingly, and the beat stuttered, then slowed. The swirling dust collapsed inward, pouring into the wound, trying to seal it. "Now!" Mardez roared, slamming his axe into the same spot. The heart cracked, then split. The storm convulsed. A wall of sand erupted outward, smashing men from their feet and slamming them into the columns. The green light flared one last time before shattering into 1,000 flickering sparks, fading into the dark. When the dust settled, the storm was gone. The air was still for the first time in what felt like days. The heart lay in two halves on the altar, its petrified flesh crumbling into gray dust, but Erich knew as he looked at the wreckage that the death of the storm would not mean safety. Somewhere behind them, back in the throne room, Khepra-Zahn had felt what they had done, and he would not be far behind. Chapter 14. The breaking of the seal. The storm was gone. The endless roar that had battered their ears, the constant whip of sand against skin and armor, gone in an instant. In its place was a ringing stillness, heavy and unnatural, as though the world itself was holding its breath. The shattered halves of the petrified heart lay in a heap upon the altar, flaking away into dull gray dust. The golden veins that had anchored it had withered to brittle strands, snapping and curling like dead vines. The swirling dust in the air had settled to the floor, where it clung in thick drifts around their boots. Mardez leaned on his axe, panting. "We did it," he said, the words half in disbelief. Eric's eyes narrowed. "No, we've changed something." As if to prove him right, the floor trembled. It was subtle at first, just a faint shiver underfoot, but then it grew. The black stone tiles cracked in a slow spiderweb pattern, and from somewhere deep beneath came a sound unlike anything they'd heard before. A dry, chittering rasp, so low and so deep that it vibrated in their ribs. The herald's head, still bound under Mardez's arm, began to laugh. "The heart was a seal," it crooned, "and you have broken it." The tremors intensified. Small fragments of stone fell from the vaulted ceiling, striking the floor with sharp clicks. The cracks widened, and hot, dry air gusted up from below, carrying with it the scent of ancient dust and something sharper, the acrid tang of venom. Then the altar exploded. A geyser of stone and sand erupted upward, hurling men from their feet. One mercenary was impaled mid-air on a jagged shard of obsidian, his scream cut short as the spike burst from his chest in a spray of blood. His body slid limply down the stone, leaving a thick smear behind. From the ruin of the altar rose a shape so massive it seemed to fill the chamber. At first it was only a blur of chitin and shadow, but as it unfolded itself from centuries of dormancy, its form became clear. It was a scorpion, if a scorpion could be the size of a siege tower. Its body was a fortress of bronze-plated chitin, each segment etched with the worn hieroglyphs of Nehekhara. 8 legs, as thick as tree trunks, ended in hooked claws that dug into the stone with a sound like grinding millstones. Its tail, impossibly long, arched over its back, the stinger as big as a man's torso, the tip glistening with a drop of venom so dark it seemed to swallow the light. Its head was a nightmare of fused bone and armor, mandibles clicking in a slow, deliberate rhythm. Eyes like pools of black glass caught the torchlight, reflecting it back in thin, hateful slivers. The tomb scorpion let out a hiss that rattled their teeth, the sound echoing in the chamber like the hiss of 1,000 snakes. Then it struck. The first lunge was almost too fast to follow. One massive claw shot forward, snapping shut around a mercenary's waist. The man screamed, beating his fists against the chitin before the claw clenched. His body burst in two, his upper half tossed aside like a rag, entrails trailing in the air before splattering wetly onto the floor. The tail came next, lancing down with blinding speed. The stinger punched clean through another man's chest, pinning him to the ground. His eyes bulged as the venom coursed through him, flesh blackening in seconds. His skin cracked, blistered, and then sloughed away in steaming sheets as he writhed. By the time the stinger withdrew, only a skeletal husk remained. "Spread out!" Eric shouted, dodging a claw strike that shattered the stone where he had stood. Shards of black rock flew through the air, slicing open a man's throat in a spray of arterial mist. The scorpion moved with terrifying agility for its size, each leg finding purchase in the stone as it circled them. It swatted a man aside with a casual flick, sending him crashing into a column so hard that the marble cracked, his body folding around it like cloth. Mardez leapt at its flank, burying his axe into the joint of one leg. The blow cut deep, ichor spraying hot and black, burning wherever it touched exposed skin. Mardez's scream was hoarse as droplets landed on his cheek, eating through flesh and muscle in seconds. He stumbled back, half his face gone, the bone beneath gleaming wetly before he collapsed. The herald's head was still laughing. It has waited for centuries, dreaming in the dark, and now you have woken it. The tomb scorpion's tail lashed again, this time shattering a pillar. The ceiling groaned overhead, dust and debris raining down. The creature hissed louder, its entire body vibrating, its claws snapping in a frenzy. Eric knew they couldn't kill it here, not in these confines, not when it could move faster than they could think. "Fall back!" he roared, grabbing Mardez's body and hauling it toward the corridor. As they fled, the scorpion lunged after them, its bulk smashing through columns, its hiss echoing like a promise. And somewhere deep inside the earth, other things stirred in answer to its cry. They had broken the seal, and the necropolis was waking up. Chapter 15. The desert claims all. They ran. The black stone corridors shook under the pounding steps of the tomb scorpion, its claws smashing through pillars, its hiss echoing like the scream of some titanic predator that had never known fear. The survivors, fewer than half of those who had entered, stumbled over the bodies of their comrades, slipping in slick pools of blood, their lungs burning from dust and the acrid reek of venom. Eric was at the front, his blade clutched tight, though his arm trembled with exhaustion. Behind him came Corvo, limping badly, and 3 others, men whose eyes had the hollow, wild look of those who had seen too much. The herald's head had been lost in the chaos, dropped somewhere in the dark. None of them mourned its absence. They burst into the open air, the oppressive ceiling of the tomb giving way to the bruised sky above the necropolis. But the air was wrong. The wind had returned. It began as a low, steady moan, carrying with it the sharp taste of ancient dust. The ground quivered, and the dunes beyond the city walls began to shift, not as wind-blown sand does, but in great, rolling waves, like the breathing of some buried giant. From the heart of the necropolis came another sound, the deep, resonant boom of a temple gong, though no living hand struck it. The green flames that had burned in the tombs and braziers flared bright one last time and then guttered out. Khepra-Zahn stepped into the open, his linen-wrapped form silhouetted against the rising wall of sand on the horizon. His eyes burned like twin emerald suns fixed upon the fleeing mortals. The tomb scorpion emerged behind him, its tail lashing in great arcs, the chitin on its claws streaked black with fresh gore. Eric didn't wait to see what would happen next. "Move!" They sprinted through the wide causeway leading out of the city, the wind clawing at them with invisible hands. The sandstorm rose with unnatural speed, blotting out the sun until the world was cast into a choking twilight. The first gust hit like a physical blow, knocking Corvo from his feet. Eric grabbed for him, but the wind snatched the man away, one moment there, the next swallowed whole by the swirling dust. The storm screamed, and the dunes answered. Pyramid spires vanished behind curtains of grit, colossal statues toppled and were instantly buried, streets and plazas erased as if they had never been. The city was folding back into the desert, each structure claimed and consumed in moments. The Liche Priest did not flee the storm. He commanded it. With a single raised hand, the sand rose around him in a spiraling column, lifting him high above the ground. The tomb scorpion reared, its claws spread wide, before both master and beast dissolved into the storm's heart, their forms becoming indistinguishable from the swirling chaos. Eric's last glimpse of them was through a gap in the dust, a towering silhouette crowned with jagged obsidian, and the gleam of a stinger poised to strike. Then they were gone. The survivors stumbled clear of the valley just as the sand wall collapsed inward, sealing the necropolis from sight. One moment it loomed behind them, the next there was nothing but the endless, rippling expanse of the desert, smooth and unbroken. No one spoke. There was nothing to say. Days later, when the survivors were long gone, a lone trader picking his way along the edge of the Valley of Silent Kings noticed something half buried in the sand. He bent down and brushed it clean. It was a gold coin, worn but still gleaming, its face stamped with the image of a crowned skull. He turned it over in his hand, smiling at his luck. The wind rose. In the space of a heartbeat, the sand shifted and swallowed the coin, slipping between the trader's fingers and vanishing as if it had never been there. The desert was smooth again. The only sound the endless hiss of wind over the dunes. The Valley of Silent Kings slept once more. For now,